I will give you the spoilers now that this is going to age poorly. So this is from 2015. Why is Ukraine the West's fault? Featuring some professor, some distinguished professor. Let's hear his introduction.
So, without further ado, I would like to introduce the R. Wendell Harrison Distinguished Professor of Political Science, Professor John J. Mearsheimer.
Okay, and not just that, he is also the co-director of the International Security Policy at the University of Chicago, and he's assessing the causes of the present Ukrainian crisis. And yeah, so let's see what he's got for us, shall we?
Okay, understanding the Russian response. What is the Russian response? Two parts. First is they took Crimea and they're not giving it back. Crimea is
right. So this kind of dates it all. There's not a lot on the Crimea. There's basically one big ass seaport called Sebastopol, which it militarily dominates the Crimea. And the Russians had loads of troops there anyway. So when they seized it, all they really did was seize some checkpoints, which is probably it was a military operation that the Russian army managed to conduct with reasonable efficiency. And actually, this is quite an interesting talk. Yeah. I mean, on some of the stuff, he is so cataclysmically wrong that it bears watching, but it's also worth watching because there's a fundamental thing here. People tend to see agency, some Machiavellian genius working problems when really they're not. They're just watching random things unfold. And, some sort of examples of this. It's like watching a pigeon walk around on a chessboard and you get all these pundits looking at it and they're interpreting it as some brilliant strategy that the pigeon is enacting. And maybe the best modern example of this in history was Trump and QAnon, where Trump would basically wander around and do random things that kept him in the headlines. Fine, got no problem with that. And then QAnon would come along and interpret this as some giant conspiracy to undermine satanic child eaters or something like that. And yeah, as the old saying goes, never ascribe to malice what you can equally ascribe to incompetence. And so our distinguished professor here, he's going to make a perfectly logical argument. It really is. I mean, it's straight down the line, perfectly logical, that's going to give completely the wrong conclusions. So let's listen to his argument.
Is gone. Second is what they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater Russia, and so forth and so on. That's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the...
Yeah, Putin's much too smart to try and invade Ukraine. Well, like I was saying, you got to be a bit careful about reading logic into decisions when they weren't logically made. And it's a generic problem that all people suffer from. It's called projection. And it normally works quite well. That you only have one piece of decision-making apparatus called a brain. And obviously, the majority of it, processing power, you put into what decisions am I going to make. But it's a sort of built-in thing that if I want to predict how someone else will behave, you sort of basically pass it through the what would I do in his position routine. Basically, you use your brain and the assumption that their brain is mostly the same as yours, which is most of the time a fairly good assumption. And you can tweak it, of course, that they're a bit more selfish or they're a bit more generous or whatever. So, but the fundamental assumption is that they're rational people making rational decisions because that's what you would do in their position. And sometimes it really does catch people off guard when this just isn't true. And I remember a wonderful example of it was some police officer who had been interviewing one of these serial killers, Ted Bundy, I think. And he was having a conversation that he was trying to work out why he would do it, because subconsciously there's this thing, well, what would I do in that situation? And the bottom line is that their brain and your brain just don't work in the same way. And so it's a subliminal assumption that you're the same, and you're not. And likewise, you can run into the problem that you're ascribing agency to where there is none, like QAnon and Trump. And you've also got to be a bit careful when there are only sort of two options available in the, if you've got some bunch of prophets saying it's he's going to turn left and some saying he's going to turn right. Yeah, some of them are going to be right. But the more important thing is not whether they're right or wrong, but were they right for the right reasons. So it's when you come back to here.
Are capable of...
Oh, we're too far back, sorry.
They took Crimea. What they're doing is not trying to conquer Ukraine. There are many people who say the Russians are going to go on a rampage, they're going to try and reestablish the Soviet Union or a greater...
Right. So that's one of these sort of binary things. And there are still a load of people out there saying that he's trying to reestablish, getting the old USSR back together, reestablishing the Russian Empire, blah, blah, blah. Well, it looks like they're right at the moment because, he did invade Ukraine, but were they right for the right reasons? And anyway, I want to get on to why, so in this case, he's certainly wrong in his prediction that Putin is way too smart to invade Ukraine.
Russia, and so forth and so on, that's not going to happen. Putin is much too smart for that. You remember what happened when the Russians invaded Afghanistan? You remember what...
Right, and the examples that he gives are perfect examples that, given these examples, no rational man would invade Ukraine. Like, Afghanistan is a country of something like 10 million people or something. And Russia went in there, actually it was USSR back then, but, they stayed there for, I think it was a decade, but it was a long time, and all right, the Americans were supplying them with some fairly decent weaponry to make the Russians' life hard. But the bottom line is that all the might of Russia was just getting bled out in a country of 10 million people who didn't want them there. 10 million people. Ukraine is 40 million.
What happened when we invaded Afghanistan? You remember what happened?
Right, and he cites another example, when America was in Afghanistan. America wasn't in Afghanistan for a little bit. I think it was 20 years or something America was in Afghanistan. And, when they leave, within 10 days, the Taliban took over again. And part of that is Afghanistan is a very poor country. And all the time, America was basically pumping aid into the country. It was corruptly supporting a load of infrastructure. It was essentially buying peace. And that, of course, worked all the time. There's cash flowing in like that. But, of course, the second the Americans leave, all the cash dries up. The country basically goes to anyone who's willing to fight for it, which was not the people who were just skimming money off the Americans. So, that didn't work out so well. But, you can go back for other examples like Vietnam, where, if there's a country being supplied with weapons by someone else, and they don't want you in their country, it's going to go badly for you.
Happened when we invaded Iraq. You remember what happened when the Israelis invaded southern Lebanon? You want to stay out of these places.
So yeah, I mean, his argument is completely logical. No sane man would do this. Sure, it didn't stop America from going into Afghanistan or to Iraq, uh, or any of these other military engagements. But, his argument is actually perfectly sound, and no rational man would choose to do it.
In fact, if you really want to wreck Russia, what you should do is encourage it to try and conquer Ukraine. Putin, again, is much too smart to do that. What Putin is...
Yeah, so, yeah, you're trying to create a picture of Putin, and you're working on the basis that he's going to act rationally. And so Putin's been kind of isolated for the past few years, and people have been kind of isolated, don't necessarily have the best grip. Yeah, he's an old man as well. Don't necessarily have the best grip on reality. Michael Jackson, for instance, you lock yourself away and you don't get information that accurately represents the world. You may well believe that Ukraine really was run by Nazis, and that all you had to do was roll in the excellent Russian military, and they would all run away, and the Ukrainian people would shower you with flowers. It wouldn't surprise me if this was kind of the Russians' plan. It doesn't look like they were prepared for anything really longer than that. Now that they're in, well, they don't really have an exit strategy. I mean, what is the exit strategy? The one that worked out so well in Afghanistan? And yeah, so and he then actually goes on and sort of he goes back to the Obama years. This, so he puts it on the liberal elites.
Part of the West. And the Russians responded. Was it
so his basic argument is that Russia is old school Russia, and they don't want a Western country on their doorstep, which is basically Ukraine, and that the West was trying to export democracy to it, and the EU was trying to entangle it in sort of trading things, which is basically free trade. So extending free trade and democracy to Ukraine was the great plan of the liberal elites, apparently. Like I was saying, I don't believe any of these people had plans, let alone plans that were in this greater detail, let alone actually being able to implement them successfully.
Surprising? For some reason, President Obama and virtually all of the elites in the West were surprised. I guess this is because they're 21st century people, right? And they think that balance of power politics doesn't matter anymore. If you think these people in Washington and most Americans are having trouble dealing with the Russians, you can't believe how much trouble we're going to have with the Chinese. I'm very...
So it's actually quite an interesting talk. Obviously, bits of it have aged poorly. But the bit about China is sort of kind of true in that Russia, the entire economy of Russia is approximately that of Italy. And I have got to admit, I kind of bought into some of their hype that they actually had a fairly decent military as well. Having seen some of their, videos of the performance of their high-end military stuff like jet fighters and all that sort of thing. Now I'm pretty sure that everything that I just looked at was almost Cold War propaganda, that, we were looking at the only 5 functioning fighter jets that they had. There's the old story about the May Day parades through Red Square, and the Russians wanted to make it look like they had much more stuff than they did. It was back in the Cold War, the USSR, and so they would get the after they're driven by and taken the salute of the glorious leaders, they would sort of drive them all the way back and drive them past again. Apparently, some of these went by like 5 times or something. And in some ways, it had the effect that they wanted, in that the West did actually believe that they were massively ahead in the number of, sort of short-range ballistic missiles that they had or something. But it also had the opposite effect to what they wanted, in that it scared the West and then they did things. And likewise, the idea that Obama had some great strategy and that this surprised him, I think is giving him way too much credit. I don't think any of these politicians are thinking great strategies of the 5 and 10 year ilk, and that those that do actually have these sorts of great long range plans, like this guy, it doesn't always work out quite so well. Anyway, I want to get a second video up today about the Russian ambassador and his press conference, where he tells us that the Ukrainians are working on biological weapons, which, from a certain perspective, is true, in that the coronavirus is actually rampaging both through Russia and Ukraine, to the point where, even if you take the upper end deaths from Ukraine and from Russia, those are on a par with the actual coronavirus deaths in those countries over the same period of time. And also, the Russian ambassador is a piece of work that needs to be seen to be believed, in that, he shows these pictures of the blast damage to a hospital and says, this is meant to be a bomb impact on a hospital, and look, it's not collapsed into a pile of rubble, therefore it can't have been a bomb. And it's like, no, they're blast effect weapons, these things. You expect them to basically just blow out the windows and make everything a complete mess on the inside. You don't expect them to have that much. Basically, he shows you exactly the bomb damage you would expect from a bomb and says this couldn't have been a bomb. And it's pure old school Soviet era, 1984, up is down, black is white, right is wrong, all that sort of thing. It's just incredible. I also want to touch on the chemical weapons and the vacuum bomb level of wrongness that you're getting in a lot of the media at the moment. So hopefully I'll have that up maybe today, maybe tomorrow. Okay, see you next time. If you enjoyed that, give it a thumbs up. See you next time.